we are very lucky to again welcome Megan Bettle, who is the Executive Director of the Clinical Trials Canadian Institutes of Health Research, which of course Dr. Lamontagne referenced a few times. Megan joined the Institute in spring of 2022, where she's responsible for the implementation of the Clinical Trials Fund and other clinical trials related policy initiatives. Prior to joining CIHR, Megan worked in a variety of positions at Health Canada. She completed a PhD and a postdoc studies in molecular biology and the genetics of rare diseases. Megan is actually going to provide an overview on CIHR, the current work within the learning health system portfolio, as well as the long-term clinical trial strategy, which of course will be a wonderful bridge from our keynote speaker. Welcome, Megan.
So good morning, everyone, and thanks for having me. It's always difficult to be kind of the bureaucratic speaker following a really good speaker, so I'll do my best to keep you going through to coffee time. And I would challenge Francois to title his next grant application "The Tinder of Researchers," because I would love to see that come through the databases. So future of clinical trials is kind of a big topic. I can talk about the CIHR piece, but hopefully we can see how that expands to all clinical trials in Canada. So I'll start with a bit of an overview of what the Canadian Institutes of Health Research does, some of what we've been funding recently, what we're thinking about, kind of how clinical trials activities fit in with other CIHR priorities, and then where we're going next with our funding programs. So a bit of background, because this is a mixed crowd, just to talk about the Canadian Institutes of Health Research. So we are the federal, is that, can you hear me? I guess I should check. We are the federal agency responsible for funding health research, set up in 2000, and before that we were known as the Medical Research Council. So CIHR's mandate is defined in law, and it's really about supporting excellent scientific research in Canada to take that knowledge and help embed it and translate that into improved health for Canadians. We do this through a number of different ways. There's a focus on funding investigator-initiated research, strategic funding, so very targeted research to fill specific needs. A lot of focus on building research capacities, supporting trainees, postdocs, grad students, although admittedly not to the extent that's needed. And then building on mechanisms for knowledge translation, so to make sure that the research we fund and the evidence that comes out of that research actually gets used. CIHR has a budget of about $1 billion a year for grants, which is spread over the broad range of health research, from basic lab sciences to clinical trials and clinical research to population health. So all CIHR funding goes through eligible institutions. These are mostly universities and their associated research institutes. We don't directly fund industry trials, but researchers can develop partnerships and can bring partners into their grant applications. Some of our competitions are co-funded, so we have a lot of partnered initiatives with health charities, for example, other government departments, and we work with international funders as well. So that's particularly important in the clinical trials space because Canada is relatively small, and if we can have global trials that have a broad reach, then we get to the sample size and the high quality of trials that Francois was talking about. Most of our funds goes out through what we call the project grant. So twice a year is an open competition. So the best science is submitted for these applications. And that's funded based on peer review, and it's not targeted funding. But we do have other programs that are very focused to meet specific needs. And we have a series of 13 virtual institutes that specialize in different clinical areas. So for example, we have an Institute of Cancer Research, we have an Institute of Genetics, and those are a strategic funding arm as well. So our institutes are very good at working with partners and developing some very targeted funding to meet specific research needs in various topics. So this is very early, and I know you do need another coffee before talking about government org charts, but very quickly I will talk about government org charts because this is a new structure that I think is very important. So the Learning Health Systems portfolio is a new structure within CIHR, reporting to a single vice president who's really focused on the idea of learning health systems. So this group includes our science policy team, which is very focused on knowledge mobilization and training programs. Our equity strategies team, which is focused not just on ensuring that participants in research are diverse, but also that researchers are diverse. And so we can bring all those different perspectives together to have stronger research programs. Our longstanding patient-oriented research team works with the provinces on the strategies for patient-oriented research and is about ensuring that patients are engaged right from the very beginning of the conception of a research project. We have a couple of new structures coming out of the pandemic, an ongoing Center for Research on Pandemic Preparedness and Health Emergencies, which is meant to be a focal point for coordination, better coordination of research for all sorts of health emergencies. A small team looking at lessons learned to look at what we funded during the pandemic to see how we can do those rapid response mechanisms better. And then my clinical trials team sits within this structure as well. So with respect to clinical trials, so CIHR funds less than 20% of the trials conducted in Canada. So about 80% of the clinical trials in Canada are funded by industry. But the remainder comes from public funding and from health charities and other mechanisms. So the CIHR funding for clinical trials is probably the biggest chunk of public funding for clinical trials. Most of our trials have been funded through the open competition. So again, it's not targeted, not specific topics, but just investigator-initiated research. And on average, we fund maybe 150 to 200 trials a year through these mechanisms. These are multi-year grants that usually are $1 million to $2 million. And for projects that span a wide variety of interventions and trial designs. So we're not just talking about drug trials. This can also include surgery, behavioral trials, various healthcare interventions. So what we include in our scope of clinical trials is really quite broad. So over the last year and a half, maybe almost 2 years, I guess, my team's been working on two parallel streams of work. The first is to implement the Clinical Trials Fund, which is a specific pot of money that I'll talk about in the next slide. And then the second is to think beyond that to what we need to support a longer-term clinical trial strategy. So the Clinical Trials Fund is part of the government's biomanufacturing and life sciences strategy. So this came out in 2022 and is a big initiative that is co-led by the Minister of Health and the Minister of Innovation, Science and Economic Development. This includes a variety of investments to, well, how do I put this? So a lot of the activities under this biomanufacturing strategy are looking at what we were not able to do during COVID-19. And the investments being made under the strategy are to ensure that Canada will have the capacity to manufacture our own drugs and vaccines, to strengthen some of our underlying infrastructure, such as government-funded laboratories, and to support the entire life sciences ecosystem. So as part of this, CIHR got $250 million over 3 years to support clinical trials initiatives. Most of this funding was awarded last year in 3 major streams of funding. So the first was to support a large clinical trials consortium that brings together hundreds of researchers, 28 different research networks, and a variety of provincial organizations to build structures that will better coordinate clinical trials. The goal of this consortium is to make sure that people are working together to hopefully broaden clinical trials capacity and to also work on common barriers to clinical trials that I'll talk about a little bit later. One of the things they've just done that's really interesting is supporting a group of clinical research coordinators to be embedded in community hospitals. So as a demonstration project to show that if you can increase the number of research staff in other locations and other research contexts, that we can broaden the reach of clinical trials outside of the big academic research centers. We also funded a series of training platforms, which are intended to support the development of skills for scientists, for healthcare professionals, for clinical research coordinators, to be better able to conduct high-quality clinical trials. So we funded a bunch of them. Some of them have very particular areas of interest, and some of them are more general. Many of them have come together to start working on common approaches for training, common curricula, and to share resources to give their trainees some really good experiences. And finally, we funded a bunch of operating grants of projects that were aimed at supporting individual clinical trials for pandemic preparedness and response, critical care, and also the early phase development of new drugs. So that's very much a work in progress. These initiatives were all funded about a year ago, and some of them are still developing, but we're starting to see some really great work out of those pieces. So as I said, though, that is both limited in scope because of that focus on pandemic preparedness and a domestic life sciences industry, but it's limited in time. All of that funding only continues to 2025, which is not very much time to make big changes in the clinical trials ecosystem. So that leads us to the second part of the work of my team, which is to think about where do we go from here. So about this time last year, we completed a consultation where we pushed out a series of questions to the research community, to patient groups, to industry stakeholders, and basically anybody who wanted to talk to us. And so we got responses from people representing over 100 organizations. The actual number of responses we got was relatively small, but once we started digging into it, we found that just about every single response we got was from a consolidated group of people. So networks came together, universities held focus groups. We had somebody who brought together 20 different patient groups to give us one response. So what we got out of that consultation was very deep and very rich. So for those of you who contributed to that, thank you very much. It was great input. And we published a summary of what we heard earlier this spring, which kind of goes through all of the feedback that we got. And since then, we've continued to talk to people. So we're trying to fill in some of our gaps from groups of people that we didn't hear from, and we're trying to continue the conversation to build on what we heard. So I'll just go through what we heard from some of these themes, and some of it will sound very familiar for what we just heard from Francois. So we asked a series of questions about CIHR funding for clinical trials. The first response from researchers was essentially not enough, and we need more than 2 months to develop a proposal. Absolutely. Kind of more broadly, what we really heard is about this need to support infrastructure. So to not have people going from short-term grant to short-term grant, to ensure that the funding is sustained over a long time, and that whatever cycles of funding there are predictable and continue so people can actually plan and develop their best proposals and bring them in when they're ready. We asked about innovative clinical trials, in particular because there has been a small program through the Strategy for Patient-Oriented Research focused on different models of clinical trials. And in this context, innovative has been taken to be anything other than an RCT, which I think is a fairly outdated definition of innovative. So we heard a lot about how important adaptive platform trials are, how important different models of trials are. We'll hear more about real-world evidence a little bit later. And the value of different trial models to support inclusion of patients. So the idea of decentralized trials, the better use of technology so that you can bring trials to people who can't necessarily come into the big cities every couple of weeks for a research visit. So building on some of the things that we learned during the pandemic about how systems can be adapted to try new models of clinical trials. We did ask about this ongoing biomanufacturing and life sciences strategy and how does academic-focused grant funding fit into this space. So again, we heard a lot about needing to support researchers to continue the development of their research programs, to help them go from kind of basic science lab research through to that translational space to help navigate partnerships with industry and help to scale up their innovations. So lots of interest in support for early phase trials so if you really want to support Canadian development of innovations, make investments in early phase trials and help those products come into larger programs. And we did hear, again, continue to support capacity building. That is really important to continue to train researchers and help them develop the skills they need to make these really successful trials. So this was a fun one. We asked about the Canadian clinical trials ecosystem, what works and what doesn't. And it's complex. That's not going to be a surprise to anybody in this room, but there's the issue of federal and provincial jurisdictions with respect to healthcare. There are ethics processes, there are contracting processes. There's kind of the additional layers of Health Canada and the health technology assessment agencies if you're bringing a product to market. So it is very complex. We did hear a lot about specific barriers to research, things that slow down clinical trials. Research ethics processes, although these weren't as slow, as particularly during the pandemic, as institutional contracting. So lots of feedback there with respect to how long it takes just to get a study up and running before you can get the first patient in, and how that's a real barrier to advancing the science. And then we asked about international models, and I already said this to our speaker from the NIHR. So basically, I want to be the NIHR when we grow up. We hear a lot about other models for supporting clinical trials. We did also get mention of specific funding programs and models that we can look to from the U.S. and NIH as well. So lots of good examples for how others support clinical trials that we can learn from and build from. And we also did hear a lot about priority setting and about the importance of building systems and using things like the James Lind Alliance as a model to engage clinicians, to engage patients in identifying research priorities and kind of pulling out the most important questions to scope research. We asked about inclusion of patients, and we got a lot of comment again about building granting systems that require researchers to enroll diverse populations, to engage with diverse populations. But again, also lots of comments about the use of technology and the use of different clinical trial models to reach people, to make it easier for them to be involved. So this slide just kind of sums it all up. And the most important point of what we heard from all of our consultation was the importance of better integration of clinical trials and health research within the healthcare system. And we've already heard about why that's so important and why it really aids in developing really good research programs that then translate into high quality evidence for people. We, again, heard the importance of inclusion, the importance of national coordination rather than bits and pieces of siloed work to make improvements in the clinical trials ecosystem. And then we heard about the need for long-term funding and ongoing support for capacity building. So that's what we heard. What are we going to do with it? So earlier this year, we published this draft clinical trial strategy, and this is not meant to be a program. This is not meant to be a commitment for how we're going to do things. This just provides us with a model for how to talk to people as we're trying to build funding programs and other programs that would underlie this work. So just to go through it quickly, the elements that are in circles really represent new funding programs for clinical trials that we would propose that CIHR could develop in the future, whereas the elements on the bottom are more about how we do our work. I do have to emphasize that this is a draft model, and I don't currently have additional funding to build new clinical trials programs, but we're getting ready so that someday in the future, or should we be able to pull more CIHR money into the clinical trial space, we can start to implement some of these ideas. So again, the idea of building research capacity, we've invested in these training platforms, which are providing structured training programs and opportunities for trainees. We also heard a lot about the need to support clinician researchers more, so with salary awards. So there have been previous programs to support clinician scientists. We've really heard that there's a need to be able to find the capacity to do that in the future. Development and transformation, again, supporting innovative models of clinical trials and better use of technology. And this also includes better integration of data with what's being used in the healthcare system. Strategic funding to support the clinical trials ecosystem. There's still a need, I think, to support more research networks, to find a good mechanism to provide sustained funding for clinical research staff that aren't reliant on short-term grants, and to have streams of funding that address the most pressing needs of the health system. So building mechanisms where we're engaging with provinces and territories, with clinicians and with patients to identify some top priorities and target strategic funding initiatives to those. And finally, we should do nothing without making sure that all of the communities and patients implicated by this research are involved right from the very beginning. So creating mechanisms where we're requiring through our funding policies there to be engagement with patients, to be meaningful engagement with patients as grants are being developed, and as we get to the end of grants, to make sure that that knowledge is mobilized and taken up. So as I said, that requires new funding or kind of redirected funding. So that's something I'll keep working on. But in the meantime, how do we support the clinical trials ecosystem? First of all, I think CIHR can be using our funding policies more to drive really good, to drive the kind of science that we should be investing in, and I'll focus on those in the next two slides. But then we also need to be working with all of the other players in the research ecosystem. So we've already started to do that. We're starting to work very closely with each of the provincial clinical trial enabling organizations and with research networks, so that we can kind of tease out what's CIHR's space as a federal funder, and how can we influence the activities of others so that we're collectively working together to improve clinical trials in general. So the ultimate goal of all of this work is really to support evidence-informed decision-making. So in going back to that idea of a learning health system, it's not just invest in studies and ignore what happens after that, but making sure that all the way through that our research is then incorporated into better healthcare, and that we're learning from that implementation so we know what to fund the next time. This should support the best care for patients, efficient health systems, and further investments in making sure that we're very well coordinated. We hope will provide us with the capacity to to be able to pivot more rapidly to address the next pandemic or the next urgent health needs where we need clinical trials evidence. So that's kind of pretty fuzzy. I wanted to leave you with some concrete ideas of what we've been doing in this space with respect to how we're trying to design funding programs to meet CIHR's priorities and some of the needs that we've heard from through our consultations. So on the left, there are CIHR's priorities. This is all of the work that the funding agency is doing right now is supposed to, we should be able to articulate how it meets these priorities within our strategic plan. On the right is some of the concrete requirements that we've put into our latest set of funding for clinical trials through the Clinical Trials Fund. So, for example, we are requiring all of those applications to have a really strong data management plan. So the researchers are able to articulate how they're managing the data and how it can be accessed. We require all clinical trials to be registered in a publicly available registry, such as clinicaltrials.gov, but we also require that when the trial is done, that the results will be disclosed within a certain time period after that, and that they be open access so people can see the results of the trials. More importantly, we are also linking this to future funding. So in this last year, CIHR has started monitoring every trial that we've funded since 2022. We are confirming that the trials have been registered, and we will follow them up until they're completed to confirm that the results have been disclosed. And if that is not completed, the researcher will not be eligible for future funding. So that's the kind of the first stage of where we've put additional requirements around clinical trials funding that I think is actually going to be really important. In each of these applications, we're requiring there to be a plan to involve trainees and to involve early career researchers as part of the leadership team for the trial. We're requiring that there be a plan and a champion for equity, diversity, and inclusion for the administration of the trial, and Indigenous rights where relevant. Every application has to explain how sex and gender are being considered, how patients are being included all the way across the lifespan, including explaining if any particular age group or patient group is being excluded from the trial. And to have a bit of a discussion about intersectionality, other aspects that can affect the results of the trial. And every trial that we fund will have to have a knowledge mobilization plan, which goes beyond just, we'll publish that a few years later. There should be a discussion of how the evidence or how the information from the trial will then be disseminated so that it can be used by the people who need it. So to wrap that all up, the future of clinical trials, obviously, excellent science. You know, we need large studies. They need to be properly powered. They need to be well designed. On top of that, though, I think the future is going to be how we do the trials and what we require in those trials. So inclusion, knowledge mobilization, patient engagement as really key elements of the trials that we should be funding with public money. So I'll stop there, but I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much. That's really comprehensive. I think we met in Ottawa a couple weeks ago and talked a little bit about this. I would just like your comment on two additional components that Lord knows it's a full plate and you probably don't want additional things added. But while we're all very invested in innovation, high-tech, novel ideas, one of the things that we're missing across the board in all of the provinces and every federal plan is not that. It's a validation platform. So there's I don't think there's any limits on innovations of Canadian scientists, but there's tons of people sitting around with molecular signatures and potential therapeutic ideas. But what they do need is a validation platform, a validation set. So we do a discovery set and a validation set, and it's usually a very simple, low-tech kind of study just to see if we can duplicate what we did in a very complex discovery model. And I think that's what we're missing, and that's what takes us to potentially a real partnership with a commercial entity to do prospective validations, et cetera. The second thing is we're investing a huge amount of money in this infrastructure, and we're talking to some of these companies that are coming here, but it's not clear. Of course, it's all very secret, but whether the infrastructure that has been supported by government money, by our money, has included contracts that require that not only do they produce whatever it is they're going to produce here, but that at least 50%, for example, of the clinical development take place in Canada, so that upfront Canadians are involved in the clinical trials of these products. We get some upfront benefit, and then on the back end, and this is my final point, I don't want to talk too much, but we're never going to really move therapeutic development forward in Canada unless Health Canada, CADETH, and ENES move from the 1970s into the current stage. There's no pull to commercialize anything in Canada because of the outdated model and delay. Nothing will be moved forward here. And so I think this has to be hand in hand. This is a policy thing. I know it's complicated for CIHR to get into policy, but again, I think it has to do with a groundswell movement that we have to get reform. I think you used the word update when we spoke a few weeks ago, when I heard you speak a few weeks ago. But unless the downstream pull to commercialize things here is enhanced by a revamped, updated system, I really think all of our innovations, we keep putting money into innovations. I don't think that's where the problem is. I think steps that move it along, and especially at the downstream end, is where we need the political will. And I'm not really sure how we get that, other than a popular demand. But
Yeah.
I'd like your comments.
Great, thanks. I should have written all of that down. So I did actually take your comment back about investments in companies coming to Canada and linking that more tightly to clinical research in Canada. I did take that comment back to my colleagues at ISED. What they do with it, I don't know, but certainly that's been communicated, because certainly there has been a lot of work to bring manufacturing and to bring companies to Canada. So the question is now what? How does that develop? And certainly I think what we've seen is if clinical trials for a new drug are done in a country, those patients often, one, get to stay on the drug while it's waiting regulatory approval, and that kind of probably favorizes bringing those regulatory authorizations or applications to those countries where the trials have been done. So that is certainly important. It is a complex system, right? So Health Canada has been trying to update their clinical trial regulations for years. Before coming to CIHR, I worked on projects where we were trying to integrate the regulatory review with the HTA review. We made a certain amount of progress where now they're not completely sequential, that the HTA review is often starting when the regulatory review starts, but there's still a lot of work to be done then, because even if you get those reviews done at the same time, you still need the drug plan decisions, and you still need the actual implementation of the drugs into use. So there's still that gap between when something gets approved, or even when something gets submitted to Canada, and when a patient actually gets access to it. And having that bridge of people who've been in a clinical trial in the country, so at least some people get access, is super important. And I think I missed something in the middle, sorry. Yeah, so that's kind of interesting. I'm not sure I have a response to that, but I think I can go away and think about that. Thanks.
Thanks, Anne-Marie. Thanks, Megan, for your transparency in sharing the long-term strategy as well. Very, very exciting to see some of those elements being put into plan. With regards to the long-term funding strategy, I just wanted to ask if you can comment on really around priorities, E, and for knowledge mobilization, and B, perhaps as well, around CIHR's thinking around prerequisites, and it's maybe a bit of a pitch or an appeal, for those funding decisions to include performance measurements baked in for longitudinal programs that look and focus on how they're going to inform future program funding. So measurement of outcomes from the programs that are tied to sustainability and that capacity building that you spoke to. I have a second question, but maybe I'll...
Yeah, because I have short-term memory problems. Because I'm always thinking about how do I answer that and not listening to the second question. So here's where I become very transparent. I'm not sure research grants are the best mechanism to support long-term infrastructure. And something that I only am still wrapping my head around at CIHR is that once we can put conditions on a grant before it's awarded, but once a grant has been awarded, our level of control is very small. We usually get an end of grant report. For the clinical trials fund investments, we're requiring annual reports to follow up on those investments because we thought it was really important to understand what's actually being done. Our next round, we've included a bunch of metrics so we can better understand how long it's taking for these studies to get up and running and how well are they recruiting. So it's a very manual version of the pretty dashboards that we saw. But I think there needs to be other mechanisms which are linked to milestones, and that's not currently within the authorities of what CIHR does.
Yeah, and to be clear, I wasn't suggesting CIHR would be a party to long-term funding, but to create the performance and the outcomes measures that will and upfront planning for long-term sustainability that really should go into I think into any application that would have a long-term aspect to the strategy, so that again
Exactly.
the outcomes can inform policy or inform grant priorities for future as well.
Yeah. I think having a better line of sight into what's happening, but also having a bit more of a hands-on approach to some of these investments, because I'm all for investigator-initiated research. Here, take the money, and the science will take you where the science takes you. But if we have very targeted funding to meet specific needs, I think we probably need a different mechanism.
Great, thank you. My next question is sort of related. So, Anne-Marie, if you'll allow me. So you can give me the hook if you want. But in terms of the strategy itself and its development, and you mentioned reports, can you comment on the plans for the current investments in the CTF, whether it's the platform, consortium rather, or the platforms, including, for example, the Pediatric Cancer Consortium, for a report out so that we have an understanding and a public reporting of outcomes and recommendations that arise from that investment, because it was significant, and we hope it, again, creates a platform for where we go in the future. But can you comment on plans for that, the dissemination of the results and recommendations?
So we hadn't actually planned on reporting back from the CTF investments, although that's a very good idea. We're certainly collecting data internally because that's part of our process to say, look at the progress that's been made, and shouldn't we be able to build from this. But I think kind of reporting back is an interesting idea as well.
I can't imagine you not doing it just to make a pitch for that. I think it's a responsible requirement that needs to be prioritized. I think there's been a lot of interest from the community in this and a lot of hopes attached to it. So we're all looking, speaking from a network perspective, on what are the results, what's learned, what can we actually dovetail in and bootstrap ourselves to long term, so that our initiatives and our efforts are aligned. So
yeah, and certainly there are huge numbers of people involved and a lot of work that's gone into these investments. So we want to make sure that people see themselves in that too. Okay, thank you.
Great, thank you so much.